Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
The Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California today. Bob is off on assignment, and so it's just me today. I am joined by Candice Bernd, who is a editor and senior reporter at Truthout, and we are going to be talking about the recent rash of protests and confrontations going on in Texas at LGBQT events. Nationally, we've been seeing right-wing groups like the neo-Nazis, the Christian nationalists, Proud Boys, et cetera, protesting, intimidating, attacking events around the country, particularly if it involves trans people, most visibly drag shows, drag story hours at libraries. We've also seen mass shootings at LGBQT clubs, most recently in Colorado Springs, but then in Texas, armed community and left groups have been confronting the coalition of homophobic, racist, fascist groups. So today we're talking with Candice about her recent piece, Armed Community Groups Are Defending Texas Drag Queens from Christian Fascists. Candice, welcome back to the Green and Red podcast.
Hi, Scott. Yeah, thanks so much for having me back.
And talking about your new piece, our home state is definitely afflicted with hate. And long time hate, and seems like it's been particularly sort of public and visible, and it's part of this national strategy. Maybe we could start with a little bit of a background on the rise of why right-wing hate groups are targeting these communities and these events nationally, and then we can kind of narrow down into Texas.
Yeah, I think that we've been seeing a rash of targeting of drag events in particular around, ever since the sort of start of this whole grooming narrative really got going. And obviously what we saw in Colorado Springs has been the culmination of that attack there that took 5 lives and obviously injured so many more. I mean, that is basically the culmination of where this kind of rhetoric nationally leads. So in Texas, what that has looked like is a particular coalition formed by a UNT alumna named Kelly Neidert.
University of North Texas, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, University of North Texas, my alma mater. So Neidert earned some notoriety on campus just through her activities with the Young Conservatives chapter that she was running there. Basically held some very controversial events, invited a man named Jeff Younger onto campus, who is this disgruntled father figure who lost custody of his child and is misgendering his child. His child is trans, and so he's got invited on Fox News. He's been speaking publicly, and that event was protested heavily by students on campus. And there was a big counter protest. It became a big controversy. And anyways, Neidert has sort of capitalized on a lot of that infamy. She got really popular in, the right-wing media sphere, and has kind of been trying to use the momentum she gained there and put it into this project. It's supposedly a nonprofit called Protect Texas Kids, right? Although you can't find any records on the nonprofit. If you try to search for its 990 or its IRS form, you can't find anything on it. But she claims it's a nonprofit. And anyways, it's basically been spearheading the charge to target drag shows throughout Texas. And that's what I've been documenting for the past several months now. PTK has targeted shows from Katy, Texas to Dallas to San Antonio, really all over the state. And there's been this really far-right coalition that has formed around PTK. And that far-right coalition includes very explicitly fascist groups. We're talking about groups like the Aryan Freedom Network, American Nationalist Initiative, and a group called the New Columbia Movement. So explicitly fascist groups forming around PTK, joining her, at protests. She claims that she disavows Aryan Freedom Network, but there's lots of evidence to show the ways in which she continually partners with these groups. She's documented talking casually with what appears to be a member of Patriot Front. And just at one of these most recent protests, she told me that she is a part of this group called the New Columbia Movement. She's part of their women's league. So if you look at this group basically, you can call it a Christian fascist group. They call democracy a, quote, failed experiment, end quote. They say that unnatural equality is, quote, evil. So those are the kind of beliefs. They want to refound the country as a Christian theocracy. That's what New Columbia is. They want to refound it. So yeah, that's what that basic coalition of far-right groups has looked like in Texas.
So they want, the failed democracy, the failed experiment of democracy being that too many people have been able to gain these pesky civil rights that has happened over the last 200 years or so.
Yeah, pretty much. So, I mean, they believe all kinds of, if you look at their manifesto, what they've called for is like, they want a Roman-like system where there would be, they talk about the Romans and how the Romans have a high culture, but then the people that are subjugated under the Romans can retain their own culture, but they're under the greater like Roman culture. So that's what they want for America, is like there would be a high American culture, but like these other subcultures would be able to keep their culture, but it's just under this primary Christian, theocratic culture is what they want. So it's
and so this coalition that Protect Texas Kids is part of, which includes Aryan Freedom Network and various neo-Nazi groups and Christian fascist groups, is their goal, is their strategy to sort of appeal to like a mainstream with this sort of anti-trans, anti-LGBQT message? Is that what they're trying to do, or are they just trying to be like push an extreme to get attention and just be disruptive?
Yeah, there's a couple of prongs on that. I mean, they are popular in the right-wing media sphere. There are a couple of major influencers, Taylor Hanson and Sarah Gonzalez, who have more than 100K followers. I think Sarah Gonzalez has more than 200K or so. She hosts a show on Blaze TV. They go into while Neidert and her coalition is protesting outside, they will go inside or send somebody else to go in for them and film. And then they put that online. They'll film the drag shows, and they always, spin it as something insidious, and it ends up on libs of TikTok, or it makes the rounds. They go on Tucker Carlson, and they perpetuate this grooming narrative. And what we're seeing in Texas is they're pushing for these legislative bills that we're seeing. So the Texas legislature is currently in session right now, the 88th legislature, and we are seeing a number of bills looking to restrict gender affirming care, to ban trans people in sports, to ban, a don't say gay bill like we saw in Florida is being proposed here. So that is, on the table for this session. Neidert told me directly that she is trying to come down to Austin, here in Austin, and lobby lawmakers on some of those bills. It's important to note that her twin brother, Jake Neidert, is extremely involved as well. He is now legislative director for State Representative Tinderholt, which gives him a degree of influence over what bills Tinderholt is considering. So that's her twin brother who's directly involved in the legislative process here.
I mean, that was my question, is how much are they tied in with like the institutional right in Texas, like, with basically the Republican Party and state legislators?
Yeah, extremely tied in. I mean, so we haven't been able to identify where Kelly PTK's funding is coming from, but we know that in terms of Jake Neidert, his efforts have been funded by West Texas oil billionaires through the Defend Texas Liberty PAC. So that might be a clue. We don't know where her funding is. I would just emphasize that. But it is extremely all tied in. Yes.
And then another question I was having is, we see these groups which are, trying to fuel a culture war around, trans people, and how in tech, like it seemed like trans issues were like a big issue that the Republicans were trying to make in the election this past year, and some of this culture war stuff. And I'm just kind of curious how you think the impact of the trying to fuel this culture war is having just in general, like on the mainstream, even in Texas. And I know that there's like a little bit of a, it's very polarized in Texas, where we have the blue cities and we have like suburbs and rural areas, which are very conservative.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes more of an impact in Texas because Texas is essentially like a one-party state at this point. But nationally, I think that the appeals are not as popular. I mean, I feel like that is revealing of it though, because they continually push this. This is an obsession, on the far right. And they push them often at the national level to their own detriment, because we see, popularly that people aren't voting based on the trans issue. And I think that polls kind of show that. And it's not, this particular culture war issue is not even the most popular culture war issue, I don't think, for many voters in swing states. But I think here in Texas, yeah, it has the ability to move in more red states, not just Texas, but like more red states. It has the ability to move and push legislation.
It does seem like since like 2018, when we saw this huge voter turnout, like what I've heard referred to as like the Beto phenomenon, and we saw a lot of like state legislative seats flip from Republican to Democrat because there was such huge turnout. It does seem like even though Beto didn't win, a lot of other people did kind of come into office as a result of his wave. And I'm pretty curious. We may have asked you actually about this last time we had you on, but like I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on, is a lot of this new sort of culture war stuff, people trying to kind of polarize the electorate or the population, kind of based on their fears of what happened in 2018, about how Texas is like, I'm not holding out for it, but eventually Texas will become like a much more of a purple state, in the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a pretty clear lock on Texas. I mean, Beto lost by a healthy margin again, and with what they've done to restrict the voting here, they've really ensured that they're going to be able to keep a hold for at least the next decade or so. So I think that in terms of like trying to polarize the electorate, it's more like it's a fight among the right here to push the right in its most extreme direction. Like there are, one of the big fights coming into the legislature was whether or not, we should allow Democratic Party chairs on the committee. And so we still ended up having Democratic Party chairs. But that's really what it looks like is that the right is having, these fights among itself with its most extreme flank. And that extreme flank is pushing it, towards more and more towards the far right, and to adopt these kinds of bills and these kinds of positions. And we've seen the Texas GOP really embrace the groomer rhetoric. I mean, you can see that just if you look on Twitter, like you can see the Texas GOP tweeting out this kind of like narrative about grooming children. So it has embraced this rhetoric and this narrative at this point. So we'll have to actually see what transpires in the legislature, how many bills, are going to come up, and there's going to be a fight. I mean, there are there's been a ton of pro-trans bills filed by Democratic lawmakers, but I think that we can expect, a huge pouring out into the Capitol, kind of like what we saw when they first rescinded they tried to make abortion like surgical centers, when that whole thing was erupting around like 2013, people were filling the rotunda and whatnot. I kind of am foreseeing something like that with people pouring out. I definitely think there will be mass resistance, but we're going to have to see what happens in the legislature.
Yeah. Just to shift it a little bit, a lot of what you write about and you comment on this on Twitter and you attend these is sort of like counter protests of the right wingers protesting against drag shows, and I'm wondering if we can talk about that a little bit. Can you actually start off with how some community groups are pushing back, and then I have a specific question about the Elm Fork John Brown Gun Club.
Yeah. I mean, so this is one of the things that this is what gives me hope, right? Because it's like, for as much as Texas is really, leading the hate and at the edge of the far right, sort of like leading the coalition of the far right and showing the way, for the rest of these red states. For as much as it represents that, it also represents and is very undercovered in the way that there is mass resistance. It's not just Elm Fork John Brown Gun Club, which has gotten some headlines, just in terms of, they're clad in black, they come armed, they shield up, they've got radios, they're very prepared. But it's also everyday community members, it's moms, it's families. I've talked to people who have come out to these protests who are really everyday people who are standing there with the more or less black blocked up guys with the guns. And so people often try to characterize it like, oh, it's only these Antifa or whatever they want to call them, it's only these guys who are coming out, but it really is so many different types of people that you find counter protesting and on the other side of this. And also I would include like Christians, one of the places that was targeted in Katy was a church. And so you had a lot of church, members of that community, of that church community out, defending the church itself, against these people. So yeah, really, people of all stripes.
And so then my other question is, and it's been a pretty big response from the LGBQT community in solidarity and in defense of these events as well, right? It's not along with that. I think you mentioned that in your article.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of Elm Fork John Brown Gun Club, I mean, they're not the only armed community resistance. There are other. So one of the groups I wrote about in my article is Veterans for Equality. So that's a veterans group. They also were, one of them when I was in San Antonio was open carrying, but others were concealed carrying. And yeah, LGBT members of this veterans group were also out doing, and it's the same thing that Elm Fork does, but they're just coming at it from a different direction. So again, just to emphasize the diversity of what armed self-defense looks like in these communities, is it doesn't just look like uniformly clad in black, you know what I mean? It's all different variations, but we're seeing it more and more, and that's what I think is a more powerful narrative about Texas. When people think Texas is all one way, for as much as it is reactionary, it's also really rad. It's also at the center of armed left-wing resistance, and I think that's to its benefit.
And in Florida, I believe they passed and DeSantis signed off on a bill that made it a felony to host a drag show, and that he has targeted venues to lose their liquor license and things like that. Is that some of the legislation that we're seeing in the Texas legislature being proposed?
Yeah, definitely. So there's 3 different bills looking at, businesses, if they hold a drag show, that they have to be categorized as a sexually oriented business. And there's also more extreme bills, but I don't think that they have a chance of passing. And even like the Florida felony thing seems like it's going to be challenged. But
Oh, it didn't pass. Okay, I thought it passed.
yeah, well, so I'm actually unclear on that too, to be clear, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely runs the gamut. I mean, there are more extreme bills, but I think, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick just laid out some of his legislative priorities, and basically the main priorities at this point are banning gender affirming care, passing a Don't Say Gay bill, and making businesses that host drag shows like quote unquote sexually oriented businesses. Those seem to be like the three bills that have the most steam on the right, that like there is most support for on the right, but also, resistance on the left. So those are the priorities. Dan Patrick just indicated those are his priorities going into the session. Abbott is giving his State of the State address tonight, so we'll have to see what he says.
It's too bad we can't ban Dan Patrick. He's particularly aberrant.
Oh, absolutely. And Ken Paxton.
Yeah, and I don't even get started on Ken Paxton.
Yeah.
Talking about the Elk Fork John Brown Gun Club. They're just maybe give the audience a little background on them. They're based in Dallas, I believe, correct?
Yeah,
Dallas, Fort Worth. The
Dallas Denton area. Yeah, for sure. They basically started making the national. So this really got touched off after a drag brunch event in Roanoke, Texas. Got targeted in August, and Elm Fork showed up to defend it. And basically ever since then, it's every time, the PTK and the right and the usual suspects come out to do a drag show, like Elm Fork is there. They show up early. They're prepared. They're just very coordinated. They're a left-wing, very, very pro gun rights group. And yeah, I mean, I will say for their part, I've never seen that level of coordination. As an organizer or journalist, I've never seen, they have really great operational security. You can't, it's hard to get an interview with them. Like they're, you know what I mean? They have great OPSEC. And that's for a reason. They are protecting themselves. They are being targeted by PTK. Kelly Neidert, there's a doxing war going on where she, that's an active effort where they're trying to like uncover who they are and dox them. They wear masks, like they try to protect their identities as much as they can. But yeah, so that's why is like there is an active campaign to dox them. But yeah, I mean, where they go, they also bring, like when they were there in Princeton, the organizer of the drag event there told me he got a lot of pushback because of their presence, because, conservatives don't like the people dressed in black in masks being there. That makes them very uncomfortable.
With guns.
Yeah, especially like armed. Yeah. So, that's Elm Fork. But I feel like, they have really been a great example, where I haven't seen these other. So there's other John Brown gun club chapters that have popped up now across Texas. There's one in San Antonio, and there's also one in Austin that have popped up since Elm Fork, was created. So that you can really see that they're sort of like leading by example there, and they inspired people. Yeah.
So there's a number of groups like that around the country. There's Redneck Revolt, absolutely. And there's like Socialist Rifle Association.
Yeah, totally. So they're in that tradition.
Very much. Totally. My question is, how do the police respond to the John Brown Gun Club in particular at these demos?
Yeah, no. So I mean, I've been to 5 of them, and I can tell you that the police response is very inconsistent. Like it's been across the map. There's been better times and there's been worse times, but generally they try to separate the groups. Like they just try to keep them separated. But, like in Grand Prairie, it was very awkward. I feel like they could have definitely done a better job, because there was a street divide and they had the option of putting them on one side of the street and the left-wing folks on the other side of the street. But instead they were like mashed up. The only thing, they just like put up a police barrier and they were mashed up like it's hard to describe, like on the sidewalk. And they just could have done a better job. And they were really close. Like the two sides were really close. And the only thing that was separating them was just like 4 police officers. They brought in bikes at one point, but it's like they could have staked out the sides earlier, but they didn't do that. So generally that's how they've approached it. I mean, the biggest police response I saw was in Katy, Texas, where there was like riot cops on ATVs, like they were across the street and we were on the other side. And it was a pretty big street with a median. And so all the cops were in the middle. But even then, you know, and there was a lot of cops out in riot gear, and some Proud Boys who were on the other side still were able to cross over. And they got over onto our side, and it was some members of, I believe, Screwston Anti-Fascist Coalition or Committee, that might not be the correct name, but affiliated out of Houston, who pepper sprayed some of them and got some of them to cross back over, but it wasn't the cops. It was, you know, again, they just defended themselves there. So that's, you know, what I've seen on the ground, at least.
Yeah. And do you think, maybe kind of moving towards my last question, I'm kind of curious, you know, Texas is a bastion of reactionary politics. And do you think that this is representing a sort of an escalation or an evolution from where it has been before? Or do you think, I mean, if we look back in Texas history, there's like white mobs which, you know, riot and lynch Black people in East Texas. And I'm familiar with one in Greenville, Texas that happened in the 50s. But do you feel like this is an escalation, or do you feel like this is par for the course for like Texas reactionary politics?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's hard to say anything is new under the sun in Texas in terms of the how bad the reactionary politics gets here. And being sensitive to that, I would say that, you know, I think it's significant for modern for our modern history. It's can be considered an escalation in that sense. But when you take the longer view, yeah, it's just another one of the ebbs and the flows, you know what I mean, throughout our politics, where we're seeing the flow again, and hopefully with enough resistance we can get it to ebb back once again. But it's a fight, and yeah, I mean, what we're finding on the ground, aside from, you know, what's happening in the Capitol Rotunda, on the ground, it is more and more becoming a situation where people are realizing that we have to directly defend ourselves and that we cannot rely on anybody else. I mean, that's basically the situation. That's what you're seeing on the ground, is they're targeting our communities, and people are not looking to a savior. They are getting armed. They're getting their LTCs. They are forming coalitions with, you know, if they don't want to hold a gun themselves, they're working in coalition with those who are prepared to do that. I mean, so that's the kind of situation that is happening now on the ground. So I feel like that kind of says it all right there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to wrap on.
Yeah.
Folks, we've been talking with Candice Bernd, editor and reporter, senior reporter with, senior editor, I apologize, with Truthout. Her new article is "Armed Community Groups Are Defending Texas Drag Queens from Christian Fascists." You know, Bob and I are both from Texas and definitely have great interest in stories like this. And so we'll probably be having more in the future. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to make a donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or go to our Patreon at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. We're also now a part of the Labor Podcast Network. Big shout out to them, and also check them out because they're great. And Candice, thanks for joining us. And folks, we'll talk to you all again soon. And don't forget to go misbehave.
The guns are still, and the dead remain. Buzzards swarm, where the children play, searching for souvenirs. No time to mourn when the new day comes, like the essence of coffee in my cup. I'm still warm, but hollow. Hold the line on the high road. Hold with a patience for polish and protest. Hold the line with full devotion in the ashes. The heart's a precious stone. Politicians pray, but they will not listen. On their collars are pins and ribbons, paper proof of our tears, our calls for help, and our cries of pain. We raise our arms before a warm embrace. Now, my friend, the enemy, hold the line on the high road. Hold with a patience for polish and protest. Hold the line with full devotion in the ashes. The heart's a precious stone. We swing and step in good company, but the road is long, longer than it seems. I'll live these days, the rest of my years. I may tire, but I won't disappear. I'm a stone that paves the way. Hold the line on the high road. Hold with a patience for polish and protest. Hold the line with full devotion in the ashes. The heart's a precious stone in the ashes. The heart's a precious stone.